Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. Behind me, 2005 Honda Odyssey. We're gonna be replacing the passenger CV axle. That's the right side CV axle. So let's get started. First thing we wanna do is jack the vehicle up, put it on jack stands, and pull that front tire off. So first thing we wanna do is take off this axle nut, because if we can't remove the nut, we can't proceed. You'll see a spot where the nut has been bent or peened into the axle shaft. You wanna take a flat screwdriver or a punch and just bend that back out. If you don't have power tools, you could take a flat screwdriver, put it in between the caliper and the fin in the rotor, and that locks the wheel. Then you can get your socket on here and break it loose with a breaker bar. The axle nut is a 36 millimeter, and I brought the heat. Now we'll make sure the axle can move freely, and it does. If it doesn't, because we're replacing it anyway, just take a big hammer and you can beat on it to get it loose. Now the manual has you pull off the lower ball joint, but I find it easier to take off these strut bolts. They're a 22 millimeter and the knuckle can slough forward. Before we take those off, we want to remove this brake hose bracket, 12 millimeter. Let's get that out of the way. And on this side is the wheel speed sensor. I'll bring you around and show what that looks like. So right there's the wheel speed sensor, 10 millimeter bolt, wiggle it out. And we don't have to remove it from the strut itself, just from the knuckle. All right, we'll just pull it off. Give it a good twist and wiggle. All right, there we go. And just wipe it off so it's nice and clean when we put it back. Now, if you're having trouble pulling this out of the knuckle, you can disconnect it here from this bracket in the back, and then right here on the body of the car, pull that off just to give us good slack with this cable, but pulling it out is the best if you're able to. All right, 22 mil on these bad boys. And if the other side starts to spin on you, you can hold it with a wrench, another socket, or a pair of pliers. Get these bolts out. Kind of wiggle if you need to. Now we want to separate the knuckle from the strut. Usually it'll just wiggle out. If you need to, you can get a pry bar in between here and just kind of pry on it a little, but it should wiggle out. There we go. And then we'll pull it off to the side and just watch how much slack that this has. You don't want to pull it too tight. There we go. Now we'll push the CV axle out. Perfect. That's it out of the front. Now I'm going to take a bungee cord and just bungee this up so it doesn't fall over on us. All right, there we go. And we still have a bunch of slack in our brake hose, so no worries there. Just so you can see what we're prying off, this side slips over an intermediate shaft, so it doesn't go into the transmission. So on this side, it's a two-piece shaft, an intermediate shaft that goes from the transmission to a bearing, and then this slips onto the end of that intermediate shaft. So I'm gonna crawl under. I don't think I can show you, but if I can, I'll definitely make sure to show you what I'm doing. So here's the trick from underneath. The manual has you remove the exhaust. So if you're not able to do this, removing the exhaust is the manual's method, but you don't have to. If you have a pry bar, see my pry bar right here, and it goes in between this pipe here, goes in between and up at an angle, throw it back in just like that, and it goes right there, just enough to get in on there. And then on this end, you hit it with a hammer, and that pushes the whole axle out. That's enough to pop it off. You can see I already did it right there. So it's popped off and loose. So let's go out, pull it out the rest of the way by hand. Now that we got the inside popped loose, we can just pull it out. There we go. And we want to coat this with just a little bit of grease. Doesn't take a lot, just a little. That way it doesn't seize on there. It can come off in the future if needed. And we'll do the same thing to the other side of the CV axle. We're also gonna clean off all this gunk, grease, debris as much as we can. Now we're ready to pop on our new one. Just make sure the splines line up. There we go, just jiggle it around and it'll slide in. All right, so that's it from the inside. Now I'll bring you back out. We can finish putting this together. I'll take our bungee cord off. Move this back out some. Actually, before we do this, I'm just gonna hold this up. What we wanna do is put anti-seize on this end. So just rub that around, get it all over. Now you don't wanna get it on your threads here for the nut, just on the splines. There we go. Now we'll slide this in. Perfect. We also don't want to get this on the brake rotors. So if you do get it on the rotors, just go ahead and wipe it off. Use a solvent like brake clean or whatever to get it off. Okay, again, find the splines, make sure they line up. If you need to rotate anything, you can rotate the hub here. Might take just a little bit of wiggling, but it'll go in. Now we'll get one strut bolt and put this strut back on. There we go. Slides back on. Put a bolt through just to hold it. There we go. I guess we can just put the other one in too. Might as well. So you might want to tap on it just a few times to make sure that that back is completely set in. You can always go back under the vehicle, eyeball it, just to make sure that it's all the way in. Then we put our new nut on that came with the new strut. Tighten that down real quick. All right, that is it. I will get you some torque specs and we'll finish buttoning this thing up. Our lower strut bolts are 116 foot-pounds. Our spindle nut is 242 foot-pounds. This brake bracket can be tightened to your likeness, same as the wheel speed sensor, tightened to your likeness. And that's it. Take it for a test drive. All right, there you go. That's how you can replace a CV axle on a Honda Odyssey. This spans over a couple years. I'll put it either in the description or the title of this video, what years it spans over. Next thing you want to do is take it on a good test drive. Make sure there's no new vibrations, no new sound since the repair, and you're good to go. All right, if you found this video helpful, please consider buying me a coffee in the link down below. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. See you on the next one.